Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this conversation titled The Trump Years and the Road Ahead, Socialists in Conversation. So we will be hearing today from Robert Coffey, John Ryman, Lala Peñaranda, and Emmanuel Santos. The four of them will be speaking from different perspectives about what the Trump presidency meant for the capitalist and the working class in the United States, and what are the challenges or what will be the challenges for the left and social movements under a Biden presidency, among other things. So I will be moderating this conversation, and I want to thank Socialist Corps for inviting me to participate. As you can see, my name is Elvira, and I am a member of Venezuelan Workers' Solidarity. Before we begin, I want to explain a little the dynamics of this conversation. I will introduce every speaker before they talk. Each of them will speak for 10 minutes, and then they will each end their interventions with a question or a couple of questions for the audience, so that in the second half of this event, we can have a more informal conversation. And I guess if everyone's ready, we can start. I think we will start with Robert. Is that okay? Okay, so I'm going to introduce Robert first. Okay, Robert Coffey is a revolutionary socialist who is a co-founder of the Socialist Workers Alliance of Guyana. He lives in Brooklyn, works in child welfare, and is a rank and file member of DC 37 Local 371 and the chair of the DC 37 Progressives Caucus. Robert is also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and is part of the National Afro-Socialist Caucus Executive Committee and organizing committee member of the New York City DSA labor branch. So I'm going to hand over the word to Robert.
Thank you, Elvira. So in addressing the question of what Trump represents and the challenges of a Biden administration, I think it's helpful to scale back or zoom out a little bit and just give a brief analysis of where the current capitalist system is at this time. And Marxists, Trotskyists especially, are known for saying that the capitalist system is and has been in a state of crisis for some time now, and have often been sometimes ridiculed as like crisis mongers, right? And I think living in the United States, especially one of the richest imperialist country in the world, where there's a certain level of social stability that's been established over the last few decades. When people speak to the crisis of capitalism, it's somewhat easy to say, like, what crisis are you talking about? You know, like working people might not have it as bad as they used to, but you know, people are still able to get jobs. They're able to get housing and generation. And I think that in speaking of the crisis now, as those things become less and less of a reality for larger swaths of people, it's an opportunity and an opening to dig below the surface of capitalism, to speak to the economic crisis it faces due to the way the system is set up and the crisis of profits which underlines the capitalist system, the long-term crisis, as well as the periodic crises of capitalism, which pop up from time to time. And we should especially comment on the increasing frequency of these crises and the growing intensity of the crises as well. So like, if you just take like a long view of US history and you go back to, for example, the period of the Great Depression in the 1930s, the popular narrative says that was ended through the intervention of the New Deal program. But with the New Deal in place, which was wrested through the mass struggles of the working class around building the CIO of the time, the Congress of Industrial Organization, we see that the state of the economy had not changed qualitatively, and what lifted the United States out of the Depression was the intervention of the US into World War II and the economic activity that came about with that, as well as the contracts the United States secured for rebuilding parts of Europe and Japan. So subsequent to World War II, the US went through a period referred to as the post-war boom. And it's during this post-war boom of economic prosperity that this conception of the American dream kind of gets like lodged in the national consciousness. And it's very significant that Trump appealed to this era when he spoke about making America great again. And it's also significant that the Democrats at the time, in their tone-deaf response, said that America's already great. And the reality is, and what Trump was able to tap into, since he is someone who seems to have a better sense of the emotions of the working class than the Democrats, he was able to tap into the real suffering happening in the working class, especially in rapidly deindustrializing areas, but for the wider working class as well. And specifically in the context of still struggling through the recovery from the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession, I think Trump was buoyed into the office by a populist wave. And that populist wave was represented both in the left wing and the right wing. On the right, there was Trump, who grounded himself in the Tea Party movement through advocating the racist birther conspiracy about Obama. And on the left, we had a figure like Bernie Sanders, who has been longstanding pushing a program of welfare capitalism, but who got buoyed, especially during the Occupy Wall Street movement. And it's also significant that both Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party didn't really make much of a dent on the intended goal of like kind of giving the mass of people more democratic control over the state. And as those movements fizzled, they kind of invested their energies into these semi-Bonapartist figures, larger than life figures who were positioning themselves as outsiders against the establishment. According to Trump, he was going to drain the establishment, drain the swamp, which represented the establishment. And Bernie was going to change the normal operation of things by breaking up the banks. So I think while it's easier now to accept the narrative of a crisis, especially since we're facing a very protracted economic crisis, an acute public health crisis, and a crisis of racism against which there was a rebellion this year, the underlying crisis of the system is reflected not just in a crisis of the working class, but a crisis of the ruling class. And in the conception of the state as the executive committee of the ruling class, one could imagine that within this executive committee, there's great debate and turmoil, right, about which way to take the state in the context of the waning power of the United States on the global scene, as well as the decimation of parts of the working class at home. And Trumpism, I see as a response that says, throw caution to the wind, step over democratically established norms and procedures, and build an alliance with the most open and naked parts of the state, fascist vigilantes, law enforcement, and crush as swiftly as possible anything that looks like it could threaten the social stability of the state. So I think in the competition for state power represented by the election in 2016, it was very hard to anticipate Trumpism, and we can all say, you know, hindsight is 2020, but in the election this year in 2020, having looked at the 4 years of Trump in office, we had a better chance to say what is represented here is a more acute danger to the working class's ability to both live and struggle, and especially the extent to which we're organized. So if the second question is then, what are prospects under a Biden administration? We have to then recall that the normalcy of the Biden administration would take us back to is that tone deaf, America is already great type of response to the crisis. And we can definitely expect austerity measures both on the federal, state, and municipal levels to come down. Here in New York, for example, in New York City, we're facing a $5 billion budget deficit. At the state level, we're facing about a $60 billion deficit. And the automatic response is to, of course, cut into the social reproduction and wages of the working class to pay for the crisis. And many of the unions have gone along with this to a certain extent. My union, for example, DC 37, has struck a deal with the city to avert layoffs by deferring payments into our welfare fund between now and June of next year. And it's pretty ironic because these are the same unions that have been championing Joe Biden as someone who will come and rescue us from Trump. And I think the best we can expect from Biden is that he won't take the specific aggressive steps that Trump has taken, such as like a Muslim ban, reinforcing the Lavender Agreement, the family separation policy, and the buildup of concentration camps on the border. But Biden will be forced to, and I would argue even if Bernie had somehow won the Democratic primaries and won the presidency, Bernie would be forced to implement austerity measures because of this protracted economic crisis that we're in, underlined by the long-term crisis of profits we have in the system. So in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that for people examining this question of what Trump represented and how we can respond under a Biden administration, it would be important to note the ways in which the ability for the working class to struggle and organize is compromised under various regimes, and to ask if it is part of the diversity of tactics that socialists embrace to choose one wing of the ruling class over another in certain elections. Because I think that's been one of the major sticking points, right, in the social discussion on these issues, whether it is permissible in principle for revolutionaries or for any types of socialists to call for and advocate a vote for a bourgeois candidate in general and for a Democratic candidate in particular. I think another question to pose would be the, what's the best way to put it? The effect of a Biden presidency on the United States imperialist ambitions, especially thinking of China and the America First policy that the United States put forward. Like many of us on this call, for example, have built and struggled with comrades from the Lausan Collective in Hong Kong and have seen like the fierce struggle that erupted there for democracy and a mass movement put forward by young people, and the ways in which the Chinese Communist Party and the government on the mainland has supported a repression of that movement. And how does that then figure into our analysis of imperialism, especially given that some people thought that because Trump was a less effective president and a less effective imperialist, that he'd somehow do less damage on the international scene than Biden, who's a politician. So I won't belabor the point, and I'll yield my time there.
Thank you so much, Robert. If anybody, while one of the panelists is speaking, has any questions, anything that comes to mind, please feel free to put it in the chat and we will address it in the second half of the conversation. So I'm going to introduce John now, John Ryman. John is a retired carpenter, senior recording secretary of Carpenters Union Local 713, expelled for fighting for the membership against the bureaucracy, and he's editor at OaklandSocialist.com. So, John.
Okay, well, thank you, comrade. And I'd like to start, Jim Mattis, Trump's former Secretary of Defense, recently co-authored an article on the on Foreign Affairs website. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Foreign Affairs is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is probably the most important capitalist think tank in the United States. And Mattis is one of the top military people in the United States, and as such, really represents in a lot of ways the strategic thinking for the tops of the capitalist class. And that article attacked the whole slogan of America First. And what they wrote was, America First means America alone. And they talked about quote, the fundamental truth that the United States cannot protect itself or its interests without the help of others. They went on to talk about the need for a system of alliances, first and foremost through the diplomatic corps, in order to defend both political stability at home, what they called the American way of life, and US capitalism's interests abroad. And I think that that article, and there's been a number of articles of a similar vein in Foreign Affairs, I think that that article perfectly illustrates the fact that Trump has been out of control of the major sectors of the US capitalist class. And that in itself is a crisis, a crisis that has no precedent, I would argue, in US history since the US Civil War. That's quite a statement, but I think that the more that you look into it, I think that that is the case. And we should remember that Trump was not their first choice. Their first choice in 2016 was Jeb Bush. And when his campaign just collapsed like a house of cards, then they had a perfectly acceptable second choice, who was Hillary Clinton. And they were all absolutely stunned when Trump won the presidency. And it was an example of the extreme weakening of the ability of the US capitalist class to influence the thinking of huge sectors of US society. And that weakness resulted from, number one, the end of the American dream, as far as workers or large sectors of the working class and of the middle class, the dream of having their own home with a white picket fence and a new car every few years and sending their kids to college and so on. The end of that dream, and also the weakening of the power of US capitalism abroad. And it left tens of millions of Americans yearning for some idealized vision of the good old days. That is the meaning of Make America Great Again. And the capitalist class has been somewhat divided on Trump, with some supporting him. Then their attitude was really expressed best through the editors of the Wall Street Journal, who, especially when Trump pushed through the tax reform, they completely supported him, but they never controlled him. And that reflects a certain, what you could call lumpenization of the capitalist class. Large numbers of them who think first and last and everything in between of next quarter's profits, and the strategic interests, more long-term, of their system as a whole, hardly enter into the picture. Now, major sectors of the class, of course, opposed him from the start and continue to oppose him. On the one hand, because of his foreign policies, which were geared, well, both foreign and domestic policies, which are always geared to his personal interests versus the interests and the strategy of any major sector of the US capitalist class. And we saw that time and again, most clearly, of course, with his attacks on the system of alliances with other major capitalist countries, which was most clearly exemplified by his attacks on NATO. You see just another example where Trump welcomed the intervention of Putin and Russia into not Syria, not Ukraine, but right into the US capitalist's own backyard, into Venezuela. Domestically, the US capitalists rule. A key, essential element of their strategy has been divide and conquer, first and foremost through racism, but also supplemented by misogyny, homophobia, and xenophobia. But also to keep that on the back burner, to keep it simmering away, but not allow it to boil over. And of course, Trump has encouraged it to actually boil over. Also, we know that under bourgeois democracy, or what we know as our democracy, that they need a certain element of rational fact-based thinking in order to advance and win a base for their policies. And you see that most clearly as far as COVID-19. And Trump has vastly undermined that sort of thinking. Now, in the last few years of his administration was dominated by his struggle to gain direct personal control over all wings of the US government. That is the meaning of his firing of officials in the State Department, in the Department of Injustice, what they call the Department of Justice, and so on. But he was unable to fully do so. What that really amounted to was not a tendency towards fascism, but towards what we know as one-man dictatorship, or as Marxists know as Bonapartism. But he was never able to firmly establish that. He was trying to move in that direction. Now, this weakening of the capitalist class and of their rule does not mean a strengthening of the working class, just the opposite. It meant a strengthening of what we call populism, or populist reaction, and right-wing demagoguery. And what that shows is that it was not just a crisis of the capitalist class and capitalist rule, but we also have, and we have to admit it to ourselves, we have a crisis in the US working class. And one single fact illustrates that crisis. The fact that after all these 4 years, that 40% of voters, or slightly over 40% of voters from union households voted for Trump. And amongst white voters from the union households, over 50% voted for Trump. And I saw on different Facebook pages for construction workers the most horrific anti-union, this is amongst union workers, attitudes expressed. Quote, "Your health care is not my responsibility." Another, "Capitalism? You mean job creators? A poor man never signed my paycheck." Another, "Little children being ripped from mothers' arms? Who put the kids in this situation? Now we're paying for their bad choices. Don't believe that fake news. These illegals are treated better than our veterans." And you saw comments like that over and over and over again. And as the voting statistics that I cited shows, these were not just isolated examples. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we get here? And there's been a weakening of the industrial sector of the working class, which has historically in all capitalist countries been the most conscious sector. But that's not all. There's been a 75-year war waged against all the best traditions of the US working class. And it was not only waged by the capitalists and their propaganda arms, such as the media, the education system, and so on. It was also waged from the leadership of the working class itself, which in the United States is the union leadership. They have had a tremendous propaganda campaign. I used to see it in my union year after year after year, how we have to help the contractors make more profits. It's called the team concept. And they encourage selfishness. They brought the bosses, and they're not just in the building trades, incidentally, but in also the so-called progressive unions. They brought the bosses and the representatives of the bosses into the unions to advocate pro-company attitude. And as for those workers, those union members who struggled to maintain the best fighting traditions from the 1930s and so on, they dealt with them. They sought to ostracize them. They at times even collaborated with the bosses in getting those workers fired, at times even blackballed, even other times physically assaulted them. So that has been a major part of the crisis in the working class today. And we should not also forget the role of Stalinism, and not only the foul stench that it left for socialism in the nostrils of many workers, but also how Stalinists linked up with the union bureaucracy and also the Democratic Party, and also had a massive influence on the left in general. Now, recognizing all of this, which we must do, it serves no purpose if we don't use it as a basis for figuring out how to change things. If we don't ask, well, okay, but what are also our potential sources of strength? And we have to look back in the last 6 months or so to the hundreds of thousands of people, all across, mostly young people, all across the country that participated in the Black Lives Matter protests. And that those protests have had tremendous accomplishments, in particular, gaining the general recognition amongst white people of the systemic racism that exists in US society. But we also have to see it in the context of the number one issue that confronts the US working class, which is the need for the US working class, as for any working class, to play an independent role in society. An independent role that can only come about at first through the need for its own mass work, for an independent mass working class party. And incidentally, in my view, it's almost definite that it would not, certainly in its initial stages, be a revolutionary party, but it would be nevertheless a huge step forward. So we have to see the Black Lives Matter in that context. And I think that in some ways it was similar to both the Occupy movement and also other movements around the world, such as the Yellow Vest movement in France, that was uncoordinated. It didn't have a clear class base, and it didn't have a clear class program. But I think that that is most likely the way an uprising of a sector of the working class will initially develop in the United States. And within such a movement, I think we have to put forward a clear class program and also call for and try to build democratic structures and a democratically run organization within that movement. In other words, that would be how a working class political party could start to develop, and I think would most likely start to develop, is not through mainly running candidates for office, but through the struggle in the streets and in the workplaces and in the unions. And in other words, so I think that our most important task is to map out the general trajectory, what is both possible and necessary for how a movement can start to move towards political independence for the working class, which is to say, a mass working class party. And within that, then, to make an assessment of what is the actual concrete situation today. And based on that, what are the next necessary and possible steps today that we can take in that direction? And in that context, I think that the thing that we should be calling for and trying to organize is protests against the policies of hunger that both the Republicans and the Democrats are collaborating in. You see the news has been dominated by pictures and videos of thousands and thousands of people lining up to get one goddamn carton of food. And I would guess that if they got that carton of food and got back on the end of the line, that they would have eaten that food before they got another carton of food. And I think that we should be calling for protests around that all across the country. Now, just one qualification is that huge shocks are inherent in the situation. And you see, for instance, that act of Israeli terrorism where they murdered that scientist in Iran. And a new war, for instance, could spring upon the scene and dominate events. But within that, with that qualification, just to repeat, and I think that what we should be what we should really be thinking about is, what is the main task of the working class? What sectors can lead that? And how can, in this particular situation versus in general, what are the concrete steps that can and need to be taken towards that more general overall goal?
Thank you, John. We're going to hear next from Emmanuel. I will introduce him quickly. Emmanuel is a member of Socialist Corps, which is a sympathizing group of the International Workers' Unity Fourth International. So, Emmanuel.
Hello, comrades. Thank you for organizing this panel. It's great to be here. So thank you so much for your analysis and interpretations of the Trump administration. I agree with both Robert and John about how this nightmare that became Trump came about, and the Trump administration was a symptom of the crisis of U.S. imperialism that, for a number of years during the George Bush Jr. Administration, there were U.S. foreign policy was bent on destroying, invading Middle Eastern countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're still suffering from the consequences of the imperialist foreign policy put in motion by not only by Republicans but by Democrats. So I would say that the Trump administration it did not emerge in a vacuum, but it's more of a continuity of past administrations, both Democrats and Republicans. In terms of the prospects with the Biden administration, I think that the left shouldn't have any illusions that we could push Biden to the left. If anything, Biden has been complicit in strengthening imperialism and also the attacks on workers in the United States. For what I can see, Trump there were 70 million votes for Trump, and that brings up a big question. Why is it that millions of people voted for this reactionary, recalcitrant politician? And the answer is that there's no political alternative. Those who voted for Biden, many of his followers, of course, but there are millions of people who voted just to kick out Trump. Those who voted for Trump, there are right-wingers, there are reactionaries, evangelicals, and there are people who see themselves as independents, and they know quite well that there's no other alternative. So I think that for the left, one of the tasks is to build a political alternative, independent from the Democratic Party, that can mobilize people to fight against fascism and racism, and continue fighting, organizing people during this crisis, this healthcare crisis that have been so mismanaged by the ruling class. So people voted against Trump, but as Robert was saying, the Black Lives Matter movement play a key role in in the election, but also the women's movement from the beginning of when Trump took power, the first days of taking power. Women went out on the streets and mobilized to fight for women's reproductive rights, and this is part of a larger movement that it's taking place in Argentina and Poland and so on. So I think that for the left, it's important to organize here in the U.S., but also to link up with other movements abroad and coordinate our struggles, and eventually build a party of the working class, a party that will fight for reforms, and we're not make any compromise with Wall Street like Biden is willing to do. So I think that that should be part of the discussion, and not creating any kind of illusions in this new administration. Also, I think that the slogans of the Black Lives Matters movement are still relevant. I think it's important that we continue to mobilize in the streets against police brutality, defunding the police, and fighting against structural racism. And there's no I don't have any illusions or hope in Biden in terms of dismantling the system of incarceration or oppression that exists in this country. Biden is another a typical conservative politician who uses progressive rhetoric to demobilize and co-opt left-wing movements. So I think that we need to be aware of some of the tactics that the ruling class is implementing to demobilize workers and all the social movements that are mobilizing. In terms of sorry. So okay. So another demand that we should be supporting as revolutionaries is relief for all workers. We need unemployment benefits, and if this new administration is really interested in controlling the virus and preventing more deaths, we will need to go into a lockdown, and that means people will stay home, and the government would need to provide some kind of relief for those non-essential workers who are facing hunger and poverty and need to pay rent. So there's a big task ahead for the left, and I think that essentially we need to come together, and we need to unify our side and break away from any attempt to unite with the Democratic Party, and build the political opposition that is needed in the U.S.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our last guest, Laura. Laura, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So Laura is a socialist from Colombia. She is a labor organizer with trade unions for energy democracy and a member of Internationalism from Below and Science for the People. She is the Americas co-chair of the International Committee of Democratic Socialists of America. So Laura, thank you.
Gracias, quería. Thanks to the other panelists for the insights. So yes, I guess I'll start off by saying I am the co-chair of the Americas for the International Committee, although I think that part of being in that role has demonstrated just how weak even, how weak this particular socialist organization, DSA, is regarding basic international debates, and really how much we need both comrades in the outside, sort of strengthening currents around internationalism from below, and also ultimately folks, inside joining the dots, because I think we are sort of losing really basic arguments, and that's a larger reflection of what the left is potentially doing wrong in terms of building independent movements, and solidifying arguments through political education, through struggle and practice, through solidarity in the streets. But I think I'm starting off that point of critique because this is a moment that requires that. I think we have enough sort of recent experience, especially coming out of the 2008 Great Recession, to know exactly what Joe Biden is going to do in the presidency to, quote unquote, revive the economy. There are no surprises. We know the agenda. We have not only the, his entire sort of political career, but his actual role during that administration. And I guess I'll start off by saying that so I'm in West Virginia right now, and West Virginia is interesting because it had a period of 80 years of rule by the corrupt West Virginia Democratic Party, and it was a party that was completely at the mercy of the corporations in the state, and that ultimately led to the party's implosion. And today we have, West Virginia being a red state, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that states like this one, the sort of labor struggle, the sort of then labor management co-optation or whatever cooperation, because of Democratic Party pressures, the demise of that militancy, and today sort of a state that, sure, some folks vote red, many don't vote, and many vote Trump, while simultaneously participating in some of the most militant labor strikes in recent memory. I think these contradictions are ones that point to some of the faults of the left, and also point to the general routes of the roadmaps that we have to consider. But I'll get into West Virginia in a minute. So just to recap sort of where we are, these are numbers from the Economic Policy Institute. The pandemic has left well over 25 million workers taking massive hits because of the pandemic, well over 7 million having experienced cuts in pay and hours, well over 3 million who are unemployed, but also misclassified in a number of ways. And these aren't recent, these aren't the most updated statistics, but well over 5 million who have dropped out of the labor force altogether. Local governments are suffering from local tax revenue cuts. And you have, let's see, states, let's see if I want to jump there first. Yeah, you have states who are like West Virginia, who are seeing a sort of economic collapse. Many of the coal mines have closed. A lot of the natural gas industry has at least seen a decrease in demand. The pipeline workers that pumped in lots of jobs and superficial, temporary economic movement, but movement nevertheless, into these towns. You have them facing a situation of a president that is known for fiscal austerity, and that being one of Biden's sort of main convictions throughout the course of his political career, and sort of a lifelong belief of the importance of compromising and reaching across the aisle. And he hasn't entered the White House yet, and he's already telling us that, that his main plan will be to unite America, to reach across the aisle, to fight for bipartisanship, et cetera, et cetera. So you can completely understand how states or counties in states like West Virginia, all of which voted for Trump in the case of this state, are fucking pissed, right? They know that Biden was in charge of the $800 billion stimulus plan in 2009. They know that Biden focused most of his energy on making sure that the money didn't fall, quote unquote, into the wrong hands, i.e. that the money wasn't, quote unquote, misspent, and that taxpayers weren't scammed by undeserving recipients, right? And we know that every person in these Trump voting counties and everywhere across this country needs money in their pocket, needs affordable public housing, they need food on the fucking table. And if the recovery plan isn't going to start there, then we are going to see a return to Trump. We need to sort of address not just those very, very basic issues, but also some of the workplace issues that West Virginia has recently made headlines for. And one of those, of course, is the great West Virginia wildcat strike of 2018. And I think these are all, this is my first time in West Virginia, but I find it so fascinating to come to this context because it again represents so much of I think what the left is doing wrong. So you had the 2018 wildcat strike, and there's all these historic parallels, which I'm sure you're familiar with the militancy of the late 60s, the 70s, but also, specifically the UPS strike of 1987, the Chicago teacher strike of 2012. But in West Virginia, it was interesting because, as you know, the strike was illegal. It was a wildcat strike, and it received national headlines, partly because of the working class history of the state. There was a lot of chanting of "We're not going back. We are the union bosses. We're going back to the table." And in West Virginia, I think there's an example of fuck the Dems, fuck the Republicans, fuck the coal corporations. We know when we're being bought out. We know when we're being scammed. And there is a sort of rank and file militancy that exists here with a lot of other sort of oppressive beliefs, but that is the sort of fire that will need to be lit and maintained to fight Biden. Biden, again, being sort of corporation friendly, sure, proposing some of the green transition demands, but in a way that is, a sort of neoliberal pro-boss agenda, like guarantee sort of a transition for the corporations, not for the workers. And I think one of the main differences that we can say existed with the militancy, the rank and file militancy of the post-war years here, was that precisely it was riding this post-war economic boom, and it also had, I guess, the civil rights, the sort of inspiration of the civil rights movement. Today we have, yes, the Black Lives Matter movement, we have the teachers' strikes, but ultimately we are in this period of uninterrupted working class defeats, of austerity, of guaranteed austerity with the continuation of Obama's policies through Biden. And as we all remember, Biden was chosen by Obama to be the fiscally conservative, sort of to calm the angst of the corporations and the ruling elite. So yeah, again, in West Virginia, there's this sort of like, we hate the politicians, we hate the corporations, and we remember whoever sides with us in the strikes for fair wages, for better working conditions, and that may sometimes be Democrats. There are some Democratic heroes, but these heroes are won literally just by the basic premise of standing in minimum solidarity, sometimes rhetorical solidarity, with striking workers. And historically, it was the coal corporations that West Virginians organized against. Today, it's natural gas companies. And I think these are the struggles that need to be highlighted when liberalism and some socialists, start talking about a very vanilla Green New Deal that we know is already being watered down, right? So yes, West Virginia is, sort of called this Trump land, but again, you have people who participated in the Wildcat strike and who voted for Trump. And I think, just as Robert was saying, sort of what called on some of the rural working class white voters to perhaps sometimes know that Trump wasn't going to fix the problems, but be called by those promises, that there is some truth to those, at least in the context of West Virginia. At the beginning of the Trump administration, there was a boom in West Virginia due to the jump of natural gas prices. That was in 2017. He relaxed the regulations in oil and gas and expedited the pipeline approval. There were approximately 16,000 pipeline workers in 2018 in the state, and that outnumbered the coal workers. These are workers that work typically for a few months, and most of this growth has gone away with COVID and through the terrible management of the COVID crisis. In 2020, West Virginia no longer ranked as the worst labor force participation, as having the worst labor force participation rate in the United States. It surpassed Mississippi. There was a 75% job growth in energy in the state. And by the end of 2018, the average paycheck was almost $900 a week. These actually do align with some of the demands or some of the promises that Trump made, right? He vowed to save the coal industry despite, or he vowed to save the coal industry and signed a bill in 2019 protecting pensions for some of the retired miners. These are material things that Trump was able to deliver and that Biden will not, again, because primarily his, I guess, commitment is to protecting corporate growth through some sort of environmental transition. And this is part of the work I do. I work with Latin American unions on energy transition demands, and often, as will be a surprise to absolutely nobody on this call, we have workers who vote for right-wing candidates. I'm thinking specifically of some oil towns in Colombia, knowing that they are working against their own interests in the long term, but having sort of short-term material gains and protection, and knowing that, well, once these jobs are gone, we'll just move to the next town. It'll be hard, but we'll make it. There is no alternative. We are not being promised an alternative. And as other panelists have said, the only alternative is the one built bottom up, is the one built to stay, not to make these towns sort of the ghost towns that we've seen and miserable ones, but to fight to have public services of quality, to have these jobs be transitioned in a dignified way that not that promotes, but that maintains some of the union culture. I was looking at Biden's plan for rural America, and it's predictably depressing. He mostly promises an expansion of rural infrastructure, promising $2 trillion for that. We know where most of that, whose pockets most of that stimulus is going to line. And let's see. I think as socialists, we have to be clear that to climb out of the current economic hole, we will need to organize, campaign for independent trade unions that will not be bought by Democratic Party promises, but that also demand massive public investment and, of course, income support, and that have material consequences both in the immediate term, in the middle term, and in the long term. I think it's extremely hard to talk about a Green New Deal or to talk about future promises when nobody other than maybe labor militants in maybe the 70s, but usually as far back as the 30s, have delivered those goods. And sure, it is important to recall on that history. I think most of these towns remember that history, but to ground these struggles in sort of the day-to-day burning fires of labor demands. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about Joe Biden's plan, or at least his declared plan so far for Latin America, because that's where I'm from and that's where I work. But maybe we can get into that later. I think I'll leave it there for now. But yeah, I'll just close by echoing the calls that others have made for the importance of maintaining political independence in unions and in the broader labor movement, in broader political movements, and how we're going to accomplish that, I think, is sort of the question of the time under the Biden administration. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura, Robert, Emmanuel, and John, for your interventions. And I think that now we can probably open this up for anyone in this call that would like to ask any questions or just comment on anything that has come up during this conversation.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you a little distorted.
Oh, it's probably my internet's not very good. I don't know if you saw in the comment section, I'm Calvin Taylor from Conversation with the Socialist podcast, and I also do a YouTube channel that I read news from Socialist Party websites and Green Party websites. My question is, are you guys as a organization in touch with the international portion of Socialist Alternative? And if so, are there any tips that they are trying to give organizers on how to campaign in a better way, update you guys' strategy in regards to elections?
Who would like to answer that?
Did you? Oh, sorry.
Is that directed to someone in particular or just a general question for the four?
The the one that just spoke.
Laura. Laura, what do you think?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank
I
you.
personally am not, but I mean, I actually just have more questions for you then. I'd be curious to know sort of what they're prioritizing, what regions they're working on, but I don't personally have connections with them.
Okay. And well, I since I do conversations with both socialist, communist, and Green parties, I've been asking whether or not the ISA as well as the SA as well as other leftist organizations are going to get together and unite during midterms and other places when, if say, depends on if any states have ballot blocks for SAs or for Green parties. If you guys will campaign with them to make sure that that either one get elected.
I mean, maybe others also want to chime in. I think most or all of my organizing energy right now is going to be put on some of the points that we mentioned of how to build labor power from below that is going to sort of outlive whoever is in power. But maybe others have want to chime into that question.
I'd like to comment if I may. So I'm not a syndicalist and I'm not opposed to the workers' movement participating in elections, but I think that we have to start from how we think things will develop. And I don't think that political independence for the working class will develop in its initial stage through running people for office. And I think that we shouldn't overly focus on that. I think that both the current situation and the whole, all the traditions of the US working class would indicate that the main way that it will develop is through the movement in the streets and in the workplaces and in the communities. And I think that given that, that's where we should be focusing our attention. And in particular, as I said, trying to build some sort of, even if it's just small in the beginnings, but some sort of campaign in the streets and in the workplaces and in the communities around this question of hunger and what is going, lack of food and what's going to be coming with it, which will be tens of millions of people evicted, and campaigning for a return to the $600 a week supplemental unemployment pay for everybody, for including undocumented workers, for everybody.
Okay. A comment and follow up. In that case, why not focus 50-50 on both elections as well as being in the street protesting? That way, the organizations develop a reputation of being rebellious, but also going for those offices to show people that we're more than just talk, we're willing to run. And with that action would show the activities of willingness to change through elections instead of just showing up on the streets, which is a great way of getting the attention and getting the point across. But you also need to have election representatives to change from within. That's not Democrat or Republican. I mean.
John, would you like to?
I would also like to extend an open invitation for interviews, so just let you know.
Well, I'll reply to that, and then maybe we can move on and see if other people have comments. But look, I've been involved in election campaigns, and it takes a lot of energy. And as I said, I think that the focus should be on how things actually will develop, not how we think they should develop or would like them to develop. So I'm not against running people for office, but at this point, as I said, I think there's a different focus. So,
thank you, John. And thank you for the question. We have David, whose hand was raised a few minutes ago. David?
Hi. I've been actually very sick with COVID, so I don't know how long I'm going to hold out here. But I think I want to. Well, first of all, I thank the three speakers for the presentation. All very interesting points. I think we need to talk about what we're, who we're talking to, and who we are. And to say we're socialists when we're, I think, 12, 13 on the call, and there's, I don't know, something like 70,000 people in the DSA. And there was a discussion by several speakers, particularly Manuel and John, about breaking with the Democratic Party. So I think we start by saying, well, I think this conversation is amongst revolutionary socialists, which doesn't preclude, as John Ryman said, participating in election campaigns, but one would be following then, you know, the Leninist strategy of election campaigns, which is to be in extreme opposition to the bourgeois system, effectively using the campaign as a platform to denounce the chicanery that takes place in bourgeois government. But if we are revolutionary socialists, and then we look at the programs of demands that are being raised here by the speakers, one problem we have here is that the revolutionary left is not united. And I actually think this is a call for self-reflection. I mean, to be honest, what could possibly be dividing us of such importance, given the time frame that I think we have to look forward going forward? John raised the danger of war. Well, if that's, and I share that fear. I also think that since we're seeing fascist forces already organizing, we have to say that the clock is moving faster than it was before. We really don't have a lot of time, so I can't see what crucial political differences are dividing the revolutionary left from coming around a program of minimum demands, and that would be meaningful, the we to which John Ryman referred several times. Because otherwise, we can say we can have the perfect set of demands in the program, but it's just not going to have any impact. Today, while resting, I read Trotsky's Whither, France. Again, it's been about 20 years since I'd read it. He makes a really important point, and I think it reflects a lot on success of people like Trump, is that there were plenty of political parties with very advanced and good political programs in France, but the workers basically didn't believe those leaderships would fight for those programs or could bring them to bear. And they weren't so much concerned about the programs as they were about the viability of a leadership, whether it would actually fight or go anywhere. Secondly, so I think that revolutionary leftists should be looking at some kind of unity per force. I think we have little time left. Secondly, if we're talking about the danger of war, and then we bring up, as John does, and I agree again, Stalinism and its role in demoralizing and demobilizing, causing confusion, well, I think it needs to be pointed out that every anti-war coalition in this country is led by Stalinist forces. And if there is the danger of a new war, because we're already in a decades-long war, and the vanguard comes out into the streets looking for anti-war leaderships to lead their mobilizations, who are they going to find? They're not going to find us. They're going to find the Stalinists, because they're the only ones with anti-war coalitions who will be able to organize large rallies. So we've given up that fight before it even started. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, David. We all hope you feel better. Recover fast. We have Jim next. We can't hear you, Jim. No. I think you're not muted, but I can't hear.
I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah.
I have to adjust my my sound. Okay, I'll start over. I live in New York City. I've been a revolutionary socialist for a long time, several decades. And, I'm in a very small organization, the LRP, the League for the Revolutionary Party. So if anybody feels the need for being in a larger group, we do. We've been struggling for many years. But there's reasons why the left is divided, which has to do with very deep differences and different approaches. And you can't just build unity, pull it out of the thumb and say, we all want unity. We all know unity is necessary. We all need to be in one big group. The problem, if you came together with a set of minimum demands, it would be very hard to distinguish yourself from those who are not revolutionaries. So people would say, well, what's the point? How are you any different from anybody else? I think it's important to be able to participate in these struggles that people have been outlining that are very important. I was very moved by the description of the situation in West Virginia. I can relate to that a lot because when I was young, I lived in Appalachia. But we have to be able to go into these movements with a clear identity of who we are and what we have to offer and what kind of leadership is needed in the long run. What kind of program answers not just the bread and butter issues that are so critically important right now, but what answers the fundamental questions of how humanity moves out of this incredible crisis that's afflicting the whole world. Now, I thought John Ryman made some really interesting points and observations about how a working class uprising or upheaval or revolt could develop. And I think those points are worth considering. I think there's a lot of merit to thinking very clearly about how the struggles are likely to develop in this country. But what I would like to say is that I don't think that we want to go in with an idea that the way we think they're likely to develop is what we are for, that we just simply want to see that and we want to push that in that direction because we think that's the most practical thing. I'm not saying that's what John is saying, but I think that if you say what we need is another big reformist workers' party because that's more realistic, we don't think there can be a mass revolutionary party, I think then you're saying, well, let's not look for a revolutionary party. I think what you have to be able to do is go in, we're very small, we're very isolated. We have to go in and fight for unity in the class while raising our own political program, which should be a revolutionary program, which should have transitional demands like Trotsky outlined, but should not be designed in a way that shuts us off from people who are fighting for very clear things right now. We want to be out there. So in terms of elections, I don't think that we should say that it has to be an election that the road forward is to run independent campaigns or something. They're most likely any kind of successful electoral campaign is going to have to be in the context of working inside somehow the Democratic Party because they've locked us out. Independent political action in this country is very difficult, except in a very few isolated geographical areas outside of the Democratic Party. So I believe, yes, we have to work in the mass movements, but we have to look for ways to talk to people about how we are going to approach elections, because they're going to have those questions. What are you going to do when election comes? Who are you going to be for? We have to have an answer to that, which is we do want to see an independent workers' political party. We think that the most practical program from that party is actually a revolutionary program that can unite the class, but we're ready to work for meaningful reforms with anyone. And we will support, even if we have a lot of criticisms, we will support parties running for office if they have this kind of basic independence and they are putting forward fighting ideas, principles, fighting slogans or whatever proposals that deserve our support, and we will fight to see them win so that we can test them in office and be part of a fighting movement. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jim. I don't know if we have any more questions. Does anybody else want to comment? I think we have about 15 minutes before we should wrap this up.
Elvira, I'll say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on some of these points about like, the program we need to go forward. Because I would say in the traditional Trotskyist conception, that especially with the role the transitional program played, we often feel we need to both analyze the current situation, see what parallels there are with the past towards coming up with a political program which can speak to the needs of working class and oppressed people at this time. While I think that is critically important, I don't think it plays the same role as it played historically when socialists did have these mass organizations and we did put out programs that would catch people's eyes. And I think a lot of the work right now kind of needs to refocus the kind of what Lala is doing, insofar as she's doing the work of grounding herself in the political realities and the lived experiences of the working class, and particularly some of the most oppressed sectors of the working class in Appalachia. And one could think, for example, that if the socialists had extended years or decades of this kind of energy into finding such roots to the Black working class, what role socialists may have been able to play during the most recent Black Lives Matter uprising. Because as tremendous as that movement has been, and as conscious changing, as John pointed out, as the movement has been, we can't say, for example, that they're identifiable socialists who have been at the lead of the movement, nor can we say that the demands coming out of the movement have been explicitly tied to the necessity of having a revolution, a necessity of overthrowing the state. And instead, we kind of see that the big step forward the movement has taken toward abolition is not tied to the question of revolution. And we're hearing of this question of abolishing our arms of the state, such as the police and the prisons, without an abolition of the state itself. And given how polarizing, especially Black Lives Matter has been, to the extent that people think the Democrats are in support of the demand to defund the police, whereas they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, I think it would have been really illuminating to have the socialists there. And to me, like, that's how you figure out what the demands are, by being part of these struggles underground, being part of the immigrants' rights struggle, for example. So, and historically, that's been the Achilles heel of the American socialist left, that not only have they not grounded themselves in the most oppressed sectors of the working class, they at times had prejudiced attitudes towards the most oppressed sectors of the working class, or just stood aloof from their struggles and said, that when the revolution happens, it'll take care of all these forms of oppression. So I think while it's important to have a program, it's also very important in a localized way to say, how can socialists get themselves involved in the work of changing the world? And in doing that, I think you have to acknowledge the extent to which working class people are as smart as the average socialist, right? And when things like elections happen, they'll say, oh, hey, you're those people I was talking about, politics. What do you think about this election? What should we do? And we have this like general orthodoxy that just says, elections, class struggle in the streets, in the workplaces, let's get it done. But like when the millions of people who lined up to vote for Trump and Biden did so, what they're trying to say is that they're trying to come into political life themselves. And they may not have found the Democratic Socialists of America, they may not have found socialism, but it's a political awakening. And we as socialists need to find a way to relate to that. And I think we've kind of bent the stick too far in one direction, because like Lenin says, for example, that the liberals believe that the class struggle is done away with because we do have mechanisms of bourgeois democracy. And that the socialist response is that, no, we want people participating in these mechanisms, because the more they participate in it, the more they realize that it can't fulfill the needs they have, right? That like, we can vote Trump out of office, but we can't make Black Lives Matter through a vote. But people are not going to learn that lesson unless they themselves go through the experience. And if the socialists are not alongside them when they go through this experience, if we're not going through the journey with them, they're not really going to listen to us, because we'll just be those people standing outside yelling about the dangers. You know, like people say, for example, the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social struggle. It's true. But if people are entering the graveyard and you're standing outside just waving a sign saying beware graveyard, you might look like a loon and they might not trust you. If you go into the graveyard with them and say, I'll see you through this experience, you're better off. And I think, you know, like no one has necessarily grappled with that question explicitly, but this is what has been dividing the left in the United States and the Trotskyist left specifically, that there's a conception that our understanding of what the political independence of the working class means is that you can never, ever, for any reason in your life, advocate a vote for a Democrat. And I think it's led to a certain paralysis of the revolutionary left. And it was very evident in this election where a lot of people couldn't even say one way or the other if a working class person asks, how should we vote in this election? Nor could they bring themselves to say the logical thing to do is to boycott the election, that we working class people have no choice here. So as these millions of people in like historical numbers lined up for hours to vote for either the despicable maniac in the White House or the despicable neoliberal pro-austerity candidate who's less worse than him, than Trump, if you're a socialist that believes you can never ever vote for a Democrat, you're kind of like just frozen. Like, what do you do? Like, if part of what we're saying in socialism is that we have a strategy that's analyzing history and gives us an edge in the class struggle to go forward, we have to realize the extent to which a class struggle is reflected within elections and embrace a diversity of tactics. And questions like, which one should we focus on? Like, to me, those are more tactical questions for particular organizations to decide where to put their time and energy. But at the end of the day, we can't discount any of the fields of struggle available to us, I would say. And that includes elections, and it particularly includes elections in the United States because of this period of history we keep harping on, of the post-war boom, because of this particular role the Stalinists played in demolishing the possibility of an independent workers' party when they sided with Roosevelt during the time of the creation of the New Deal. You have to struggle on the terrain you're given. And part of that terrain is the fact that third parties are going to be irrelevant. But again, like if we go back to all the old United Front policies developed within the Communist International, the general methodology is that you advocate votes for candidates, not because you think when they get into office, they're going to achieve their political program, but because a significant part of the population holds that illusion in that candidate. And you advocate a vote for them to test that theory with them to say, listen, this is a no good piece of shit politician, you think otherwise, but I'm gonna go along the experience with you to show that when this person gets into office, guess what? They're gonna institute austerity. And it's not like an argument or a methodology necessarily unique to the socialists. Like this is what Angela Davis and Cornel West were saying when they said, vote Biden, don't lie about who he is, and get ready to struggle against him. So again, like I would pose the question, when two wings of the ruling class are battling for control of the state, should socialists take a side, or is it principle for socialists to take a side? And I think not having definitive answers to that question paralyzed the left, both in 2016 and 2020. And given the extreme polarization of our society, given the fact that most of the Republican legislators haven't even acknowledged a Biden victory. And if they do, the next 4 years will include Trumpism, just not in state power. This question will come to the fore again in the next congressional elections and the next presidential elections. And socialists need to dig into our theoretical tool chest to have some kind of an answer to what is really a question of living history, right? Like it's very easy to go back and say, oh, this was the class nature of the Soviet Union. And it's very easy to take position on the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. But actually coming up with positions on things happening in front of us is the real challenge. And how we grapple with that will be the measure of us as socialists.
Thank you, Robert. We have a couple of minutes left, and I see that David's hand is up again. Oh, this is a different David. Okay. Do you think that, yes, so we have David and then John. So do you think that you could both try to keep your intervention, I don't know, less than 5 minutes?
Okay, well, look, thanks so much for the opportunity, and to the various contributors. Can I say, I learned, as you may hear, I'm a South African living in the States. I've been involved in the struggle for liberation in South Africa, and now I'm here for complicated reasons. But can I say that the last contribution by Robert was quite illuminating and quite inspiring. And the two words are paralysis and awakening. And that's one thing I've felt in American politics as I'm trying to understand and explore it, is that there's extraordinary paralysis of action in the States at so many different levels, despite the state having a general democratic character in which there are even elections for judges and the like, which is not the South African tradition or the British tradition, which I've come from. But you see that this has become so much so institutionalized that actually people are not aware of the choice, and the many choices which are available are not politicized and acted on. I just want to start with a point which somewhat personal. A member of our family is a teacher. At the beginning of this academic year, she taught 28 children in one class. Now she's teaching 38 children in 3 classes. She teaches class 1 is some 8, or maybe it's 8 or 9 students. They have to be socially isolated, and that's in one classroom. Class 2 is another 8 students who are socially isolated and in an adjoining classroom down the corridor. And class 3 is online and all the rest. And it's a huge stress and it's a huge strain for teachers. And when I hear the struggle in West Virginia, it calls back to mind the struggle there in West Virginia. And I nearly got my daughter to go with me, and we wanted to act in solidarity with those teachers. Absolute marvelous struggle. So America seems so clearly tied up in bourgeois politics. And yet below, the people are struggling, not just to survive, but actually prepared to struggle and do so much more. There is an explosive nature in the society. And a society which yet has to come to terms with COVID, the pandemic. It's just not clear yet, how this is explosive this is going to be. It's people from around the world are ringing me and saying, is it true that people are traveling on planes and going from one state to the other and actually participating and spreading disease and death? Is that actually true? Is that America? Are you okay? Are you all right? That's a panic that's felt in the world when they look at America. And no one can believe it's a relatively civilized society in which most people are wearing masks and trying to avoid the disease, which David is suffering from. And really, I'm so sorry for your comrade. I really wish you the best. So there's a catastrophic situation, not only the hunger, as John has pointed out, but also the people who are struggling, against disease, struggling for life itself. Now, one of the big contradictions I feel about America is that we're dealing with a 10%. 10% of the working classes and trade unions. This is an absolute abomination. And when I hear the reports of the division on the left, this is where a start has to be made. Lala made the point, I think, about a struggle from below. Without the unions, you're nowhere. this is South Africa's experience. There is nothing that's going to change in society without unions having a voice and a strong voice, and the voice of the workers through the unions and struggles for democratic unions, and to have a workers' voice against the bureaucrats and the rest. And we have to dedicate ourselves. I'm so ashamed that I haven't done more in terms of organizing workers, that I meet in the shops and on the streets and everywhere else, and really getting the message of unionism and organizing the mass unemployed and the mass unorganized workers in America. I mean, this is the starting point, I think, for all discussions. And then we move on to this question of an independent mass workers' party, whether it be revolutionary or not. I cannot see that we can even get to the starting block unless we have mass trade unionism. A huge increase from 10%, at least to 30% to 40%. I don't see how we could even think of a workers' party until the working classes at least got to that level of organization. And then it goes concomitantly with that there is an explosive nature of racism in America. It's unbelievable. And it's not going away. Every time there's an ebb in the situation, suddenly there's another death and it explodes all over again. And socialists cannot be indifferent to that and say, yes, Black Lives Matter, we're with you, but you're not handling it correctly. We've got to be there with the Black communities in struggle, and it's not just Black communities, it's actually white communities as well. It's absolute marvelous non-racialism in practice, and to guide that, those demands so that they move towards socialist conclusions. Anyway, can I say it was a marvelous discussion? I hope I've added usefully to it, and congratulations for the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. We'll close with John.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to comment on the question of the unions. And I think that you cannot seriously talk about building the unions without linking it up with the necessity to transform the unions from top to bottom. And I don't think that we can separate the question of building the unions and transforming the unions from the question of a working class party. That it will be in part, not entirely, but in part, through the struggle for a working class party and through the struggle of breaking the unions from the Democratic Party, that the unions will be built in the first place. In other words, that we cannot be just a left cover for the union bureaucrats. Now, on the question of running in elections, and I hope I didn't come across as meaning that I was opposed to working class candidates and running in elections in general. But I just don't think that at this particular time that will tend to be the focus of the movement. And I think that we have to look at it from the point of view of not what we want, but what is likely to be the focus of the movement. Also, I know, for instance, in DSA, there is a tendency, well, the Democratic Party as a whole, including its liberal wing, in which I include Bernie Sanders, its entire thrust is away from the struggle in the streets and basically around that idea, if you don't vote, don't complain, don't mobilize into the streets. And so I think that we have to struggle against that tendency. As a movement starts to develop for the working class, or at least a section of it, to start to play an independent role, then linked with that will be the question of how do we relate to elections and the necessity for such a movement to start to run its own candidates. Now, I'd like to also just make one comment about the so-called the Transitional Program. And in my view, there is not and never has been the Transitional Program. A program is a set of demands that's intended to meet the conditions that workers face in the here and now. And those conditions obviously change over time. There's a transitional method. And I think that method is the method of trying to understand and put forward the general trajectory, the general path of a working class movement and how it will be forced to develop by the actual objective situation of capitalism itself. Not what we want, not what we think would be nice. We don't support revolution because we like it. It's because there is no way out of the crisis in which we find ourselves, aside from a socialist revolution. And so in the end, I agree that we have to put forward the general trajectory, up to and including the need for the working class to seize power and build its own state in place of a workers' state, and all the steps along that way. But I also think that it's absolutely all that talk about that is nothing but talk if we do not translate it to the specific concrete steps that can and have to be taken in the here and now. I'm not saying anybody here is avoiding that, but I just want to emphasize that. And I think at this point that we should be joining together to demand a return of the $600 a week supplement as a way of ending the hunger crisis and the tens of millions who are going to be evicted from their homes.
Thank you, John. I just want to say we just got a message in the chat from David saying, please consider discussion on Brazil. See Workers International Network Facebook page. So just to bring that to everyone's attention. We've been here for an hour and 40 minutes, so I think we can wrap up. I want to say thank you to everyone for the interventions, and thank you for everyone in the call for also participating and for being here. This might, a recording of this might be available.
It will be. It will be.
If anybody has any, we ask this at the beginning, but if there are any objections to being recorded, please feel free to state in the chat or let us know through the Facebook page. I think that's it. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
So just to emphasize for anybody, if you look at my Facebook page in a day or two, I will have the recording up if it's not under the event itself. Thank you, and signing out. Bye.